In the marble halls of Pella, where torchlight flickered against painted lions, and the scent of cedar drifted through open colonnades, a child sat at the feet of his teacher. The year was approximately 343 BCE, and the boy was 13 years old. His name was Alexander, son of Philip II of Macedon, and his teacher was the most celebrated philosopher in the Greek world, Aristotle of Stagira. The lessons took place in a sanctuary called the Nymphaeum, a sacred grove where the young prince and a handful of noble companions gathered to learn what it meant to think, to question, to understand the world through reason rather than superstition. Aristotle spoke of distant lands beyond the maps of peoples who worshipped the rising sun, of rivers so wide they swallowed the horizon, of kingdoms built upon mountains that touched the heavens. The boy listened with eyes that held something older than his years, something hungry, something that understood even then that the world was a question waiting to be asked. We begin here, in the quietude before greatness, in the years of formation when Alexander was not yet conqueror but student. The palace of Pella was itself a marvel, the largest and most magnificent structure in Macedon, its floors covered with intricate mosaics depicting hunts and battles, its walls adorned with paintings by the greatest artists of the age. Philip had built this palace to declare that Macedon was no longer a backward kingdom on the edge of Greek civilization, but a rising power that would reshape the ancient world. But Philip was often absent, campaigning in the south, subduing Greek cities, building the army that would become the most formidable military force the world had ever seen. And in his absence, the young prince learned not war but wisdom. Aristotle's curriculum was vast. He taught Alexander rhetoric, the art of persuasion that would later allow the young king to inspire armies facing impossible odds. He taught natural philosophy, the careful observation of plants, animals, and the physical world that would make Alexander a patron of scientific expeditions throughout his conquests. He taught ethics, the questions of virtue and right action that would shape Alexander's complex moral character, capable of extraordinary mercy one moment and terrible vengeance the next. And he taught Homer. Above all else, Aristotle gave Alexander the Iliad, and the young prince absorbed it as though drinking from a sacred spring. He memorized passages. He slept with a copy beneath his pillow. He saw himself in Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, the hero who chose a short, glorious life over a long, forgotten one. The choice would define everything that followed. The palace gardens of Pella were where Alexander wandered when lessons ended, where he contemplated what Aristotle had taught, where he looked toward the horizon and wondered what lay beyond. Macedon was a kingdom of mountains and valleys, of fierce warriors and ancient traditions, but it was also a kingdom that felt the pull of something larger. To the south lay Greece, culturally superior, politically fragmented, simultaneously admired and despised. To the east lay Persia, the vast empire that had twice invaded Greece, that had burned Athens, that remained the great adversary against which Greek identity was defined. Alexander grew up knowing that his father intended to invade Persia, to avenge the ancient wrongs, to spread Greek civilization across the East. The dream was not originally Alexander's, but he would make it his own, and he would carry it further than Philip could have imagined. One story from these years has survived the centuries, has been told and retold until it has become legend inseparable from history. A horse trader brought to Pella a magnificent stallion, black, powerful, wild beyond breaking. No man could ride him. Philip's best horsemen were thrown, injured, humiliated. The king was about to send the horse away when his young son spoke up. Alexander had been watching carefully. He had noticed something that the others had missed. The horse was afraid of his own shadow, was shying away from the dark shape that moved with him. Alexander approached the horse, turned him to face the sun so that the shadow fell behind, spoke softly, stroked the great neck, and then mounted. The crowd held its breath. The horse that no man could ride accepted the boy. They raced across the plain, and when Alexander returned, Philip wept with pride and spoke words that would echo through history. "My son, seek out a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedon is too small for you." The horse was named Bucephalus, Oxhead, and he would carry Alexander across the known world, into battles that would reshape civilization, until death finally claimed him in India nearly 20 years later. But the story is more than the tale of a boy and his horse. It is meditation on the nature of leadership itself. Alexander succeeded where others failed, not through force but through observation, through understanding what frightened the beast and addressing that fear directly. He turned the horse to face the sun, transformed the source of terror into the direction of travel. The symbolic resonance would play out again and again throughout Alexander's life, his ability to transform obstacles into opportunities, to make his enemies' strengths into weaknesses, to lead not merely through courage but through intelligence. The relationship between Alexander and Philip was complex, was rivalry as much as love. Philip was the greatest military commander of his age, the man who had transformed Macedon from a backward kingdom into the dominant power in Greece. He had created the Macedonian phalanx, the formation of soldiers armed with 18-foot sarissa pikes that would prove unstoppable against any army it faced. He had conquered Thrace and Illyria, had subdued the Greek city-states, had been appointed hegemon of the League of Corinth, with the mandate to lead a united Greek invasion of Persia. Alexander grew up in his father's shadow, admiring and resenting him in equal measure. There are stories of the young prince hearing of Philip's victories and despairing that his father would leave nothing for him to conquer. The ambition was there from the beginning, the hunger, the need to surpass. But there was also the mother Olympias, princess of Epirus, priestess of mystery cults, woman of fierce intelligence and fiercer temper. She raised Alexander to believe he was special, was destined for greatness, was perhaps something more than mortal. She claimed descent from Achilles through her royal line. She spoke of visions and divine signs. She planted in her son the seed of a question that would haunt him all his life. Was he merely the son of Philip, a mortal king? Or was there something more? The question would lead him across deserts to the oracle of Siwa, would shape his understanding of himself, would become the mystery at the heart of his extraordinary life. The years in Pella were preparation, were the forging of the instrument that would conquer the world. Alexander learned to think like a philosopher, to fight like a warrior, to lead like a king. He learned that the world was larger than maps could show, that glory was worth more than long life, that greatness required risking everything. He learned to question Aristotle's greatest gift, but he also learned to act with decisive certainty when action was required. The combination would prove unstoppable. The boy who sat at Aristotle's feet, who memorized Homer beneath olive trees, who turned a frightened horse to face the sun, that boy was becoming something the world had never seen before. The chapter closes in the stillness of Pella's nights, when the palace settled into silence and the young prince lay awake in his chamber, looking toward the windows where starlight fell soft upon marble floors. What did he dream of in those quiet hours? What visions moved behind closed eyes? We cannot know for certain. But we know what followed. We know that the boy who dreamed of the edge of the world would one day stand upon it, would push past every boundary, would reach further than any human being before or since. The dreams were already forming. The hunger was already there. And in the silence of those Macedonian nights, something extraordinary was preparing to unfold. The boy slept. The stars turned overhead, and the future waited, patient as stone, for the moment when Alexander would rise to claim it. The assassination of Philip II came swift as a blade drawn in sunlight. It was the summer of 336 BCE, and the great king of Macedon was celebrating the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympia's brother. The festivities were magnificent, a display of Macedonian power and Greek unity, meant to showcase Philip's dominance before the planned invasion of Persia. The ancient theater at Aegae was filled with dignitaries from across the Greek world. Golden statues of the 12 Olympian gods had been carried in procession, and alongside them, a 13th statue, Philip himself, claiming divine honors. The hubris would be remembered. The gods, if they were watching, were not pleased. As Philip entered the theater, walking in solemn procession between his son Alexander and his new son-in-law, a member of his own bodyguard stepped forward. His name was Pausanias of Orestes, and he carried a Celtic dagger concealed beneath his cloak. One moment the great king walked toward the theater, surrounded by celebration. The next, he lay fallen, the blade buried in his chest, and the world that had seemed so solid fractured into chaos. The assassin ran. He was pursued and killed before he could speak, before he could reveal whether he had acted alone or on behalf of conspirators whose identities would never be known. The mystery has never been solved. The silence of the dead guard has echoed through 23 centuries of speculation. Alexander was 20 years old. We enter this chapter through the blood still warm on the stones, through the silence that followed the screaming, through the terrible clarity that descended upon the young prince as he understood that the crown now rested upon his head, not given, but seized from the hands of fate. What he felt in that moment, no source can tell us truly. The ancient historians wrote decades or centuries later, shaping narrative to serve purposes we cannot fully know. But we can imagine, can try to understand the weight of that moment. The father who had been rival and teacher, conqueror and obstacle, model and shadow suddenly gone. The throne of Macedon suddenly vacant, the invasion of Persia suddenly orphaned, and enemies everywhere, watching, waiting to see if the young prince had the steel to hold what his father had built. The days that followed were measured in blood. Alexander moved with precision that suggests the calculating mind beneath the philosopher's education. He had to secure the throne before rivals could act. Attalus, the uncle of Philip's newest wife, commanded Macedonian forces in Asia Minor, and had spoken openly of challenging Alexander's succession. He was assassinated. The family of Attalus was executed. Philip's new wife Cleopatra and her infant daughter potential rallying points for opposition were killed, though sources disagree about whether Alexander ordered this or whether Olympias acted on her own terrible initiative. The historian Plutarch would later suggest that Alexander wept when he learned what his mother had done. We cannot know if this is truth or later apology, but we know the result. By the time the blood stopped flowing, Alexander had no rivals left alive. The securing of Macedon was only the beginning. The Greek cities to the south saw Philip's death as opportunity. Thebes and Athens, the greatest of the city-states, began speaking openly of throwing off Macedonian domination. The tribes to the north, Illyrians and Thracians who had submitted to Philip, stirred with renewed independence. The invasion of Persia, planned for years, seemed suddenly impossible. A lesser man would have consolidated, would have focused on holding what he had, would have waited until his position was stronger. Alexander was not a lesser man. He struck first to the north, marched his army over the Danube River in a campaign so swift that hostile tribes submitted before they could organize resistance. The crossing of the Danube was symbolic as much as strategic. Alexander demonstrated that no geographical barrier would stop him, that rivers which had marked the edge of known world to many Macedonians were merely obstacles to be overcome. The northern frontier secured, he turned south. The Greek cities, hearing exaggerated reports of Alexander's difficulties in the north, had begun their rebellion. Thebes had risen openly, expelling the Macedonian garrison from its citadel. Athens was organizing support. It seemed that Philip's life work, the unification of Greece under Macedonian leadership, was unraveling. Alexander covered the distance from the Danube to Thebes, a march of nearly 300 miles in 13 days. The speed was impossible. The Greeks could not believe the reports. They insisted that it must be another Alexander, perhaps a Macedonian general of the same name. By the time they understood that the young king himself stood before their walls, it was too late. Thebes was given opportunity to surrender. The city refused, and Alexander made an example that the Greek world would never forget. The destruction of Thebes was complete. The city that had once been the most powerful in Greece, that had produced sacred bands and philosophers and poets, was razed to the ground. Every building was demolished except the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, which Alexander spared in tribute to Greek culture. The population, perhaps 30,000 people, was sold into slavery. The message was clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated. Opposition would be annihilated. The young king who had studied philosophy with Aristotle was also capable of terrible, systematic brutality when he judged it necessary. But the destruction was also calculated mercy by the standards of the ancient world. By making an example of Thebes, Alexander made examples of others unnecessary. Athens, which had been preparing to join the rebellion, immediately submitted, petitioned for forgiveness, received it with surprising gentleness. Alexander demanded only that certain anti-Macedonian orators be surrendered, and then pardoned even them. The Thebans had been sacrificed so that others would not need to be. The logic was brutal but effective. Greece was pacified. The League of Corinth reaffirmed its allegiance, and Alexander could turn his attention east, toward Persia, toward the dream that his father had never lived to achieve. The chapter explores the grief that Alexander never spoke of. The father who had been rival and teacher, conqueror and obstacle, dead now, unavenged in any conventional sense, though the Persian campaign that followed might be understood as continuation of Philip's interrupted mission. What did Alexander feel for his father? The sources suggest complexity, pride in Philip's achievements, resentment of being overshadowed, desire to surpass, love that could not be simply expressed. The relationship was severed before it could resolve. Philip died without knowing what his son would become. Alexander lived without the father's recognition he may have craved. The grief was buried beneath action, beneath conquest, beneath the relentless forward motion that would define the rest of Alexander's life. The chapter closes in the throne room of Pella, in the quietude of some evening after the killing had stopped, when Alexander sat alone in the chamber where Philip had sat before him. The weight of the crown was metaphorical. Macedonian kings wore diadems rather than crowns, but the weight was real. He was king now. He had secured his position through blood and speed and calculated terror. He had demonstrated that he possessed his father's military genius and something more, a willingness to act with overwhelming force, a strategic brilliance that compressed months of expected campaigning into weeks. But he was also alone in ways that Philip had never been. His father was gone. His rivals were dead or cowed. His mother was a force to be managed rather than a comfort to be sought. The young king sat with his thoughts in the darkening chamber, contemplating the invasion of Persia, the conquest of the East, the transformation of the world that lay before him. The silence held questions that could not be asked, whether grief made kings stronger or hollowed them, whether the boy who loved philosophy had already begun to disappear into the conqueror history would remember, whether the blood that had secured the throne would stain everything that followed. The night deepened. The torches burned low. And Alexander, king of Macedon, 20 years old, sat alone with the weight of all that had happened and all that was yet to come. The throne carved from blood and grief, the crown that had cost so much, the future that waited vast and uncertain beyond the eastern horizon. The silence held him. The night held him, and tomorrow and all the tomorrows after he would rise to claim what his father had only dreamed of. The throne was his. Now he had to prove worthy of it. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stood on the shores of the Hellespont, gazing across the narrow waters toward Asia. The strait was less than a mile wide at this point, the narrowest crossing between Europe and the vast continent that lay beyond. Behind him stood the army his father had built and he had inherited. Perhaps 40,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, the most disciplined and experienced fighting force the Greek world had ever produced. Behind him lay Greece conquered, unified, restless. Before him lay an empire so vast that its edges dissolved into legend. The Persian Empire stretched from Egypt to the borders of India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Desert. It had existed for 2 centuries. It commanded populations in the tens of millions. Its treasuries overflowed with the tribute of conquered nations. And Alexander, 22 years old, king of a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, was about to invade it. We enter this chapter at the water's edge, where the waves whispered of all the armies that had crossed before. This strait, the Hellespont, known today as the Dardanelles, was laden with history and myth. Here Xerxes had bridged the waters 150 years earlier, leading a Persian host into Greece that would be stopped only at Thermopylae and Salamis. Here the legendary Hellenic armies had gathered for the Trojan War, sailing to besiege a city that stood just across these waters. Here the world of the Greeks met the world of the East, and Alexander was about to cross that threshold in a way that no Greek had ever done before. The crossing itself was carefully staged for symbolic impact. Alexander personally steered his flagship across the strait, and as the ship approached the Asian shore, he stood at the prow in full armor, a glittering figure catching the morning light. When the hull touched sand, Alexander was the first to leap ashore. He threw his spear into the beach, an ancient gesture, claiming the land as territory won by conquest, and strode onto Asian soil. The gesture was deliberate, was calculated to echo the heroes of myth, to place Alexander in the lineage of Achilles and Agamemnon. The invasion of Persia was not merely military campaign but sacred mission, and Alexander ensured that every symbolic detail reinforced this understanding. But before the army marched inland, Alexander turned aside. He traveled to the ruins of Troy, the ancient city whose siege had been immortalized in Homer's Iliad. The site was sacred to Greeks, was pilgrimage destination for those who revered the old heroes. Alexander walked among the ancient stones, visited the temple of Athena where armor said to have belonged to Trojan war heroes was preserved, and exchanged his own shield for one that legend claimed had been carried by Achilles himself. He ran naked around the tomb said to be Achilles, an athletic and religious tribute, and laid wreath upon the ancient mound. And he wept. The sources agree on this. Alexander wept at the tomb of his hero, mourning the man who had been dead for nearly a millennium as though grieving a personal loss. What are we to make of this? The cynical interpretation would see political calculation, a young king staging religious theater to inspire his troops and legitimize his invasion. And calculation was certainly present. Alexander was never naive about the power of symbol and spectacle. But there was also something genuine in those tears, something that reveals the strange interior world of this extraordinary young man. Alexander truly believed himself connected to Achilles, believed that the ancient hero's blood flowed in his veins through his mother Olympia's, believed that he was destined to surpass even Achilles' glory. The tomb was not merely symbol but meeting place, where Alexander communed with the shade of his heroic ancestor and committed himself to the path of glory and early death that Achilles had chosen. The tears were grief for a hero who had died too young, but also recognition of his own fate, already sensed, already accepted. From Troy, the army marched east. The Persian response was already organizing. The satraps, governors of the western Persian provinces, had gathered their forces at the Granicus River, determined to stop the invasion before it could penetrate deeper into the empire. They were experienced commanders, and they held the high ground on the far bank of the river. The Granicus was a formidable obstacle, banks steep and muddy, waters deep enough in places to reach a horse's chest, current swift enough to disorder formations. The conventional wisdom, which several of Alexander's generals advised, was to wait for morning to find a better crossing point, to avoid attacking a fortified position across a difficult river. Alexander rejected the advice. He would attack immediately. He would attack directly into the teeth of the Persian defense. The Battle of the Granicus became the first of Alexander's legendary victories. He led the cavalry charge himself not from the rear where commanders typically positioned themselves, but at the head of the companion cavalry, his elite horsemen driving directly toward the Persian commanders. The fighting was desperate. Alexander's helmet was split by a Persian sword. Only the intervention of his commander Cleitus, who severed the arm of the attacker, saved his life. But the Macedonians prevailed. The Persian cavalry broke. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service, surrounded and abandoned, were slaughtered almost to a man, a deliberate message from Alexander that Greeks who fought against Greek liberation of Asia would receive no mercy. The victory at Granicus opened Asia Minor. City after city submitted as Alexander advanced. Many were Greek colonies that had been under Persian control for generations and welcomed the Macedonians as liberators. Others were Persian strongholds that recognized the wisdom of accommodation. Alexander treated those who submitted with conspicuous fairness, often leaving local governance in place, reducing taxes, presenting himself as liberator rather than conqueror. The contrast with Persian rule was deliberate and effective. Within a year, almost all of Asia Minor modern Turkey was under Macedonian control. The western satrapies of the Persian Empire had fallen with remarkably little resistance. But the crossing at the Hellespont represented something larger than military campaign. It was transformation of Greek consciousness, expansion of what Greeks believed possible. For centuries, Persia had been the great power of the East, the empire that had invaded Greece twice and had remained a constant threat on the eastern horizon. The Greek city-states had been small, had been fragmented, had been consumed by internal rivalry. The idea that Greeks could not merely resist Persia but conquer it, could march into the heart of the enemy empire and claim it for their own, this was revolutionary. Alexander was not merely invading Persia. He was redefining what Greeks could imagine, was opening horizons that had seemed permanently closed. The chapter closes with the army moving inland, dust rising behind them like a veil drawn across Greece, the homeland receding into memory. Many of these soldiers would never see their homes again. The campaign that began at the Hellespont would stretch across years and continents, would carry them to lands they could not have imagined existed. Some would die in battle. Some would die of disease. Some would survive to old age, bearing memories of things no Greek had ever seen before. But as they marched away from the sea, they could not know what lay ahead. Could only trust in their young king, who walked among them sharing their hardships, who led from the front in every battle, who seemed to believe absolutely that destiny had called him to something extraordinary. What lay ahead was unknown, but Alexander walked toward it as though he had been there before, as though the conquest had already been dreamed, and he was merely living it into being. The crossing was complete. The edge of the known world was behind them now, and ahead lay an empire waiting to be claimed, a destiny waiting to be fulfilled, a transformation of the ancient world that would echo through millennia. The Hellespont shimmered in the distance. The army moved east, and Alexander, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, heir of Achilles, led them toward the horizon, the crossing at the edge of known worlds, the threshold between the familiar and the utterly new, the beginning of everything that would follow. The Persian host covered the plain like a dark sea stretching toward the horizon. King Darius III had gathered the full strength of his Western Empire, perhaps 100,000 warriors. Some sources claim many more. The great king himself commanded from a golden chariot at the center of the formation, surrounded by his immortals, the elite 10,000 who had never known defeat. Chariots gleamed with bronze scythe designed to cut through infantry like wheat. Greek mercenaries, the finest heavy infantry money could buy, stood ready to meet the Macedonian phalanx. This was no provincial army defending a frontier. This was the concentrated power of the Persian Empire, gathered to crush the young Macedonian king who had dared to invade. Alexander's army was a fraction of this force. Perhaps 35,000 men stood in disciplined lines, shields raised, sarissas angled toward the morning sun. They had marched across Asia Minor, had won at the Granicus, had conquered city after city. But they had never faced the full might of Persia. They had never faced the great king himself. And now, on the narrow plain of Issus, hemmed between mountains and sea, they would discover whether their king's confidence was genius or madness. We enter the battle of Issus not through the chaos, but through the stillness that precedes it. The morning mist was lifting from the Pinarus River, which flowed between the two armies. The distant thunder of Persian drums echoed off the mountains. Prayers were being whispered in languages that would never meet except on this killing ground. The soldiers on both sides knew that the day would decide everything, would determine whether Persia's ancient dominance would continue, or whether a new power would rise from the West to claim the world. The tension was almost unbearable. And then Alexander gave the order, and the Macedonians began to move. The battle tactics were Alexander's signature, calculated audacity that seemed like recklessness until the genius became clear. He positioned himself on the right wing with his companion cavalry. He would lead the decisive charge personally, would seek out Darius in the chaos, would end the battle by killing or routing the enemy commander. The center, the phalanx of Saracen-armed infantry would hold, would pin the Persian infantry in place, would create the pressure that would make Alexander's cavalry charge decisive. The plan was simple to state but extraordinarily difficult to execute. It required absolute coordination between different units, required the center to hold against overwhelming numbers, required Alexander to find and break through to Darius before the weight of Persian forces could overwhelm the Macedonian line. The companion cavalry charged, Alexander at their head, riding Bucephalus, wearing armor that gleamed in the autumn sun. They struck the Persian left wing like a thunderbolt. The fighting was close and desperate, swords and spears at intimate range, horses screaming, men dying in the crush. Alexander fought in the thickest of it, conspicuous in his royal armor, a target for every Persian seeking glory. His cape was torn, his armor was dented. But he kept pressing forward, kept driving toward the center of the Persian line, kept seeking the golden chariot that marked where Darius stood. And then he found it. Through the chaos of battle, their eyes met across the carnage. The great king of Persia saw the young Macedonian coming for him, saw the trail of dead that marked Alexander's path, saw in that moment something that made him understand the truth. Alexander was not merely a talented young commander. He was something else, something relentless, something that could not be stopped, something that would keep coming until one of them was dead. And in that moment of recognition, Darius made his choice. He fled. The great king of Persia, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, commander of forces that vastly outnumbered his opponent, turned his chariot and ran. His bodyguards followed. The Persian center collapsed in confusion. Word spread through the Persian ranks that the king had fled, and what had been disciplined resistance became panicked rout. Alexander pursued, desperate to catch Darius, to end the war with a single stroke. But night fell before he could overtake the fleeing king. Darius escaped into the mountains, leaving behind his army, his treasury, and something far more precious, his family. The Persian royal family, Darius's mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his daughters had accompanied the army, traveling in luxury behind the lines. When Darius fled, they were abandoned, captured, brought before Alexander expecting the treatment that conquered women typically received. What happened next reveals something essential about Alexander's character. He treated them with extraordinary respect, called Sisygambis mother, promised the royal women that they would not be harmed, that their dignity would be preserved, that they would be treated as the royalty they were. The sources describe Sisygambis initially prostrating herself before Alexander's companion Hephaestion, mistaking the taller man for the king. When her error was pointed out, she was mortified, but Alexander dismissed her concern. "You were not wrong," he is reported to have said. "He too is Alexander." The treatment of the captured queens became part of Alexander's legend. Here was a conqueror who showed mercy, who honored the defeated, who could be trusted by those who surrendered. The contrast with how Darius had abandoned his own family was devastating. Sisygambis, it was said, came to love Alexander more than her own son. When she later learned of Alexander's death, she reportedly turned her face to the wall and refused food until she died. The bond was real, was forged in this moment at Issus when Alexander chose honor over conquest's usual brutalities. But Issus was also slaughter on an enormous scale. Estimates suggest that between 20 and 50,000 Persians died, compared to perhaps 400 Macedonians. The disparity seems impossible, but ancient battles often ended this way. Once one side broke and fled, the pursuit became massacre. The Pinaris ran red with blood. The plain was covered with Persian dead. The wealth captured was beyond anything the Macedonians had imagined: gold and silver, silk and jewels, the accumulated luxury of Persian royalty. Alexander sent treasures back to Greece, demonstrating that the invasion was producing returns that justified its costs. The message was clear: follow Alexander, and there would be rewards beyond measure. Darius sent envoys after the battle, offering peace. He would cede all territory west of the Euphrates. He would pay enormous ransom. He would acknowledge Alexander as an equal. Alexander's general Parmenion reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept these terms. "So would I," Alexander replied, "if I were Parmenion." The peace offer was rejected. Alexander would accept nothing less than complete victory, nothing less than the conquest of the entire Persian Empire. The refusal was not merely arrogance, it was strategic understanding. Accepting partial victory would leave a powerful Persia intact to threaten his rear. Only complete conquest would create the secure empire Alexander envisioned. The chapter closes in the evening after battle, when the wounded cried across the darkened field and Alexander walked among his soldiers, learning their names, honoring their wounds, thanking them for their courage. He was wounded himself, a sword cut to the thigh, but he refused to rest until he had visited the injured, had shown his soldiers that their king shared their suffering and valued their sacrifice. The stars turned slowly overhead. The smell of blood hung heavy in the air. Persia had trembled, and the young king sat alone with the weight of what he had begun, understanding that Issus was not the end but the beginning, that the fleeing Darius would gather new armies, that the war would continue until one of them was destroyed. The fields of Issus where empires collided, the battle that proved Alexander could defeat even the full might of Persia, the moment when Darius fled and the ancient order began to crumble, the strange mercy shown to captive queens, the refusal of peace that committed Alexander to total conquest, all gathered in the evening silence, in the aftermath of slaughter, in the understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The fields, the blood, the victory, the weight of what was still to come, forever etched in history, forever the moment when Alexander proved himself not merely talented but world-changing. Forever. The island city of Tyre rose from the sea like a fortress made by gods. Two islands fortified with walls that reached 100 feet high, separated from the mainland by half a mile of deep water. The Phoenician city had stood for 3,000 years. It had survived sieges by the greatest empires of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had besieged Tyre for 13 years and failed to take it. The Assyrians had broken themselves against its walls. The sea was Tyre's moat, and the moat was impassable. No army had ever conquered the island city by siege. We enter this chapter through the impossibility that faced Alexander in the winter of 332 BCE. He had swept down the coast after Issus, accepting the surrender of cities that recognized the futility of resistance. Damascus had fallen. Sidon had opened its gates. The Phoenician fleet that had been Persia's sea power was defecting to the Macedonian cause, but Tyre refused. The Tyrians believed themselves untouchable. They sent envoys who spoke politely of neutrality, who offered sacrifices, who suggested that Alexander might worship at a temple on the mainland, while the island city remained independent. Alexander demanded entry to the city. The Tyrians refused, and something hardened in the young king. The siege that followed was one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world. Alexander commanded that a causeway be built into the sea, a mole that would connect the mainland to the island, that would allow his army to approach walls they could otherwise never reach. The project was enormous. Thousands of workers labored daily, driving stone and timber and rubble into the water. The city of Old Tyre on the mainland was demolished, its buildings providing material. Trees were felled for miles around. The sea itself was being conquered, reshaped by human will into a road where no road had ever been. The Tyrians mocked from their walls, sailed out in ships to harass the workers, killed those they could reach. But the mole grew longer, day by day, reaching toward the island like a slow-motion invasion. Then the Tyrians launched their counterattack. Fire ships' vessels packed with combustible materials were sailed into the mole. The siege towers Alexander had constructed were consumed in flame. The wooden framework supporting the causeway burned. Months of work were destroyed in hours. From the walls of Tyre cheering could be heard, but Alexander did not retreat. He ordered the mole rebuilt, wider than before. He assembled a fleet ships from Sidon and Byblos and Cyprus that had defected from Persia, ships captured from coastal cities, ships constructed from scratch in the forests of Lebanon. Within months, Alexander had naval superiority around Tyre. The blockade tightened. The mole crept forward. The siege towers rose again, higher than before, equipped with devices to fight the fires the Tyrians would surely launch. 7 months passed. The causeway reached the walls, and the final assault began. The fighting was desperate. The Tyrians defended their city with the courage of those who have nowhere to retreat. Boiling oil and molten metal poured from the walls. Stones and arrows darkened the sky. The Macedonians died in waves, climbing ladders, falling back, climbing again. But the numbers were overwhelming. The walls were breached. And when Macedonian soldiers poured through the gaps, the slaughter began. 8,000 Tyrians died in the sack of the city. 2,000 more were crucified along the beach, a forest of crosses stretching for miles, a monument to what happened to those who defied Alexander. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The women, the children, the elderly all became property, scattered across the ancient world. The destruction was nearly complete. Tyre, which had stood for 3 millennia, which had created the alphabet that Greeks and Romans would inherit, which had sent colonists to found Carthage and cities across the Mediterranean, Tyre was broken. Why such ferocity? The sources suggest that Alexander's anger had accumulated over the 7 months of siege, that he blamed the Tyrians for the deaths of his soldiers, that he intended to make an example that would discourage future resistance. There are stories that the Tyrians had killed Macedonian prisoners on their walls, had thrown their bodies into the sea as Alexander watched. That personal fury motivated what followed. We cannot know with certainty. We know only that the mercy Alexander had shown at Issus vanished at Tyre. The young king who had treated captive queens with honor revealed another face, the face of vengeance, of terrible calculation, of willingness to inflict suffering on a scale that would echo through history. The siege of Tyre also revealed something else about Alexander, his absolute refusal to turn back. Any other commander facing the destruction of the mole by fire ships would have reconsidered, would have found another route to Egypt, would have bypassed the island fortress, would have accepted that some obstacles were too great. Alexander rebuilt, redoubled his efforts, demonstrated that his will was inexhaustible, that he would reshape geography itself to achieve his objectives. The causeway that was built during the siege still exists. 2,000 years of accumulated sand have connected it to the island, and what was once a half-mile of water is now a peninsula. Alexander's causeway permanently altered the landscape. He conquered not just the city but the sea itself. But at what cost? We contemplate, in the chapter's closing meditation, the transformation that Tyre may have worked upon Alexander. The philosopher's student was becoming something harder, something capable of cruelty that Aristotle would not have recognized. The crucifixions along the beach were not the act of a man seeking to liberate Asia from Persian tyranny. They were the act of a conqueror asserting dominance through terror. The siege had taken 7 months, had consumed enormous resources, had cost thousands of Macedonian lives. The rage that followed was perhaps understandable, but understanding is not justification. The crosses stood as testimony to something in Alexander that would emerge again and again, as the conquest continued the capacity for violence that matched his capacity for vision, the darkness that accompanied the light. The chapter closes in the silence after conquest, when Tyre smoldered and the sea reflected the ruins. The causeway stretched from the mainland like a wound in the water. The crosses cast long shadows in the evening light. Something had changed in Alexander. The siege had taught him that his will could reshape geography itself, could build roads across the sea, could accomplish what no one before had accomplished. But it had also awakened something darker, something that enjoyed the power to punish, something that found satisfaction in the suffering of those who defied him. The balance between mercy and vengeance, between the student of philosophy and the wielder of terrible power, was shifting. The night fell on Tyre's ruins. The king walked alone among the ashes. And whatever dreams visited him in sleep, they were no longer innocent. The siege of Tyre, the wrath of kings, the conquest that changed everything, forever. Across the desert Alexander walked, where no army should have survived. After the fall of Tyre, after the conquest of Egypt that followed with barely a battle, the young king made a decision that puzzled his generals and amazed his soldiers. He would journey to Siwa, an oasis deep in the Libyan desert, home to an oracle of Ammon Zeus that Greeks had revered for centuries. The journey was 300 miles through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Sand stretched endlessly in every direction. The sun burned without mercy. Water was scarce, and the way was marked by the bones of travelers who had not found the next oasis in time. But Alexander insisted. Something was calling him into the desert, some question that only the oracle could answer. We enter this chapter through the shimmer of heat, through the desperation of soldiers who watched their water disappear, through the strange providence that seemed to follow Alexander even into the wilderness. The sources describe miracles along the way. When the army lost its path in a sandstorm, crows appeared to guide them, flying ahead when the army moved, waiting when the army rested, leading them unerringly toward the distant oasis. When the water ran out, rain fell from a cloudless sky, a phenomenon so unusual in that desert that it seemed divine intervention. Whether these stories are literal truth or later embellishment, they reveal how Alexander's followers understood their king. As someone blessed by the gods, protected by forces beyond ordinary comprehension, destined for something extraordinary. The oasis of Siwa emerged from the desert like a dream taking solid form. Palm trees, springs of fresh water, the ancient temple of Ammon Zeus, carved from golden stone, tended by priests who claimed to speak for the god. The Egyptians worshipped Ammon as their supreme deity, creator of the world. The Greeks identified him with Zeus, king of their own gods. The oracle at Siwa was consulted by kings and generals seeking divine guidance. And now Alexander, conqueror of Egypt, came seeking answers of his own. What did he ask? What did the oracle reply? We do not know with certainty. Alexander entered the temple alone, and when he emerged, he said only that he had received the answer his heart desired. He spoke afterward of himself as the son of Ammon Zeus, as something more than merely mortal. His coins began to show him with the ram's horns of Ammon sprouting from his head. His letters sometimes referred to his father Zeus Salmon. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Alexander was claiming divinity, or at least divine parentage, and the claim would shape everything that followed. The question that the chapter explores is what Alexander truly believed. Was his claim to divinity political calculation, a tool for ruling conquered peoples who worshipped god-kings, a way of transcending the ethnic limitations of Macedonian kingship to become a universal monarch? The Persian kings had claimed divine status. The Egyptian pharaohs were gods incarnate. If Alexander was to rule their empires, perhaps he needed to claim their divine authority. The political logic was sound. The claim made him acceptable to Egyptian priests, to Persian nobles, to all the peoples of the East who expected their rulers to be more than human. But there are hints of something deeper. Alexander's behavior at Siwa suggests genuine religious experience, not merely political theater. The dangerous journey through the desert, the solitary entrance into the temple, the refusal to reveal what the oracle had said, these suggest a man grappling with profound questions about his own nature, seeking answers that could not be found through conquest alone. Alexander had always believed himself special. His mother Olympias had told him from childhood that he was destined for greatness, that his true father might be a god. The question of his parentage, whether he was Philip's son or the offspring of divine visitation, had been with him always. At Siwa, he may have received the answer he had long sought, or he may have received an answer ambiguous enough that he could interpret it as confirmation of what he already believed. The truth is that we cannot know what Alexander believed in the innermost chambers of his heart. Perhaps he did not know himself. The boundary between belief and performance, between genuine conviction and useful fiction, may have been blurred even in his own mind. He was capable of remarkable psychological flexibility, of adapting his persona to different audiences, of becoming what circumstances required. In Egypt, he was Pharaoh. In Persia, he would adopt Persian dress and court ceremonial. In each context, he became what was needed. But beneath the performances, was there a core identity? Or was Alexander's selfhood itself fluid, capable of transformation, able to believe genuinely in his own divinity because belief and will were, for him, the same thing? The oracle at Siwa marked a turning point. Before the desert, Alexander was a brilliant young king leading a stunning military campaign. After the desert, he was something more, or claimed to be something more. The claim would create tensions with his Macedonian officers, who did not take kindly to a king who expected to be worshipped as a god. It would contribute to conflicts that would grow more bitter as the conquest continued. But it would also give Alexander a status that transcended ordinary kingship, that allowed him to unite diverse peoples under his rule, that made him symbol as much as sovereign. The chapter closes in the silence of the temple, in the incense smoke rising toward painted stars, in the secret that Alexander carried for the rest of his life. The desert wind whispered around the oasis. The priests chanted prayers in languages older than Greece. And Alexander, who had conquered armies and cities and kingdoms, who would soon conquer the greatest empire the world had ever known, stood in the presence of what he believed to be divine truth. What passed between him and the oracle? What question was asked? What answer given remains hidden? The silence is the point. The mystery is the meaning. We rest in the uncertainty, in the sacred not knowing, in the possibility that Alexander himself could not have explained what he became in that desert shrine. The stars watched. The desert held its silence, and the king walked out beneath them changed. The oracle at Siwa, the question of divinity, the transformation that would shape everything that followed. Forever mysterious, forever significant, forever the moment when Alexander became something more than mortal in his own eyes and perhaps in the eyes of history. The desert, the temple, the question, the silence that remains forever. Persepolis rose from the plain like a dream carved in stone, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, where kings had been crowned for 2 centuries, where the wealth of conquered nations had been gathered into halls of impossible beauty. The complex covered 33 acres, staircases wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast led to terraces where golden-roofed buildings stood against the sky. The Apadana, the great audience hall, could hold 10,000 people beneath a ceiling supported by columns 60 feet high. The treasury contained gold and silver accumulated over generations, tribute from lands stretching from Egypt to India. When Alexander entered in January of 330 BCE, after defeating Darius for the final time at Gaugamela, he was entering the symbolic center of everything Persia had represented. We enter this chapter through the wonder of the Macedonians as they walked through halls their grandfathers had feared. Persian architecture was designed to overwhelm, to make visitors feel the insignificance of individuals before the majesty of the empire. The walls were covered with reliefs showing delegations from subject nations, bringing tribute Babylonians and Egyptians, Indians and Ethiopians, Greeks and Scythians, all processing eternally toward the throne of the great king. The message was clear. All the world belonged to Persia. All the world served the King of Kings. And now Macedonians, those barbarians from the cold north, walked as conquerors through these sacred precincts. The treasure captured at Persepolis was almost beyond comprehension. The sources speak of 120,000 talents of gold and silver, a sum equivalent to the entire revenue of the Athenian Empire for centuries. It took 10,000 mule teams and 5,000 camels to carry it away. Alexander distributed portions to his soldiers, sent fortunes back to Greece, but the bulk was consolidated to fund continued conquest. The wealth of Persia would finance the creation of the world. Alexander envisioned Greek cities planted across the east, roads connecting distant provinces, the cultural fusion that he increasingly seemed to imagine. And then, in a single night, it burned. The accounts differ about how the fire started. Some sources describe a banquet that degenerated into drunken revelry, describe a courtesan named Thais, suggesting that the palace of the Persian kings should burn as Athens had burned when Xerxes invaded 150 years before. The suggestion was taken up. Torches were passed from hand to hand, and the wooden roofs, the cedar beams, the hangings and furnishings of 2 centuries of Persian splendor caught flame and were consumed. By morning, Persepolis was ruins. Other sources describe deliberate policy. Alexander announced that the burning would avenge Persian destruction of Greek temples, would show that Greek victory was complete, would send message throughout the empire that the old order was finished. In this version, the fire was calculated, was symbolic conclusion to the invasion that had begun at the Hellespont. The revenge for Xerxes was now complete. Greek honor was satisfied. The cosmic balance was restored. Both versions may contain truth. The fire may have begun as drunken impulse and been allowed to continue because it served political purpose. Alexander was capable of both spontaneity and calculation, often simultaneously. What matters is the result. Persepolis burned. The libraries that might have contained texts we have lost forever. The art that represented one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The accumulated memory of an empire that had shaped the world. All reduced to ash in a single night. The chapter dwells in the contradiction at the heart of Alexander's legacy. Here was a man who sought to unite East and West, who would soon marry Persian princesses and adopt Persian dress and promote Persians to positions of authority. Here was a man who claimed to admire Persian civilization, who would mourn when Darius was murdered by his own courtiers, who would adopt many Persian customs and expectations. And yet he destroyed Persepolis. Let the fire consume what could never be rebuilt. Made a choice that seems to contradict everything else he claimed to represent. Perhaps the destruction was precisely about ending the old to make way for the new. Alexander did not want to be another Persian king, ruling from Persian palaces according to Persian traditions. He wanted something different, a fusion that transcended both Greek and Persian identity, an empire that belonged to neither and both. Persepolis represented the old order in its purest form. By destroying it, Alexander was declaring that the old order was finished, that something new would rise in its place. The symbolism was violent, was excessive, was irrecoverable. But symbolism requires drama. Transformation requires destruction of what came before, or perhaps there is no justification. Perhaps the burning was simply what happens when young men with too much power drink too much wine in a palace that represents everything their people have feared and hated. Perhaps the philosophical explanations came later, imposed on an act that was not philosophical at all. The fire does not explain itself. It simply burned. The chapter closes in the morning after, when the flames had died and smoke drifted across the ruined terraces. Alexander walked through the destruction, seeing what his knight's decision had wrought. The reliefs that had shown the nations of the world processing toward Persian kings blackened, cracked, still standing but damaged beyond repair. The columns that had supported the Apadana, some still standing, others collapsed into ash. The treasury emptied before the fire, its contents safe, but the building that had housed them for generations now roofless and open to the sky. Did he regret? Was there triumph? The sources do not agree. Some describe satisfaction at revenge accomplished. Others describe the morning after clarity of a man who realizes what he has lost. We cannot know. We know only that Persepolis burned, that the Persian Empire was truly ended, and that Alexander stood amid its ashes, lord of nothing and everything, already gazing east toward lands even Persia had never conquered. The burning of Persepolis, the end of an age, the destruction that cannot be undone. The ashes that still speak 2,000 years later of what was lost, forever burned, forever mourned, forever testimony to the cost of conquest, the price of transformation, the endings that creation sometimes requires, the fire, the ashes, the silence that followed, forever. Beyond Persia lay lands that existed only in legend. The Hindu Kush, the mountains that Greek geography called the Caucasus, believing them the same peaks where Prometheus had been chained, rose like walls built by gods. Their passes reached nearly 12,000 feet, where the air itself seemed too thin to sustain life, where snow lay permanent on peaks that vanished into cloud. Alexander led his army into these mountains in the spring of 329 BCE. And what followed was one of the most grueling campaigns in military history. Men froze in their sleep. Pack animals plunged into chasms and were lost. The army crossed passes that had never seen the passage of such a force, that would not see such a force again for centuries. We enter this chapter through the suffering of the march, through the soldiers who had followed their king for 7 years across the known world and now followed him beyond it. These were men who had enlisted to invade Persia, to avenge old wrongs, to gain glory and plunder and then return home. They had achieved all of this. Persia was conquered. Darius was dead. The treasuries were emptied and the spoils distributed. By any reasonable measure, the conquest was complete. But Alexander kept marching, kept leading them into lands that had no strategic value, into provinces that no Greek had ever heard of, toward an edge of the world that seemed to recede with every step. The soldiers followed because they loved him, because they believed in him, because his will had become their will. But they also began to wonder, began to whisper, began to question whether their king knew any limit, whether the march would ever end, whether they would ever see their homes again. The kingdom of Bactria, modern Afghanistan, was subdued after 2 years of bitter fighting. The campaigns here were different from what had come before. No great set-piece battles like Issus or Gaugamela. Instead, guerrilla warfare. Mountain fortresses that had to be taken one by one. Ambushes in narrow valleys, an enemy that faded into the landscape when pursued and reappeared when the army moved on. The casualties were significant, the frustration was immense, and yet Alexander persevered. Captured fortress after fortress, hunted down rebel leaders, married Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, in an act that was partly political strategy and partly genuine attraction. The marriage shocked his Macedonian officers, who had not expected their king to take a barbarian bride. But Alexander was becoming something different from what they had known, was becoming universal monarch rather than Greek king, was building an empire that would transcend the ethnic categories they understood. From Bactria, the army descended into the Indus Valley. Here was territory that even Persia had barely touched, that existed in Greek imagination as the edge of the world. The monsoon rains turned rivers into seas. The humidity was suffocating to men from Mediterranean climates. Exotic animals appeared: elephants, which the army had seen in Persia, but also strange birds and plants and peoples unlike anything in Greek experience. Alexander was fascinated. He sent explorers to investigate, naturalists to catalog specimens, geographers to map this new world. The scientific mission that accompanied his army, a legacy of Aristotle's influence, was recording information that would advance Greek knowledge for generations. The Battle of the Hydaspes was the last great pitched battle of Alexander's life. King Porus of the Porava kingdom met the invaders with an army that included 200 war elephants, creatures that terrified the Macedonian horses, and that could crush infantry formations beneath their feet. The battle took place during monsoon floods, with the river in full spate and rain falling in sheets. Alexander crossed the swollen Hydaspes at night, achieved surprise, and defeated Porus in a battle that showcased all his tactical brilliance. But the victory came at cost. Bucephalus, the great black horse that Alexander had tamed as a boy, that had carried him through every battle for 20 years, died in the aftermath of Hydaspes. Some sources say he died of wounds received in battle. Others say simply of old age and exhaustion, his great heart finally giving out. Alexander buried Bucephalus with honors appropriate to a fallen hero, founded a city at the site of his death, Bucephala, named for the horse that had been his companion through everything. The grief was genuine. This was not performance but mourning for a friend who could not be replaced. The soldiers saw their king weep for a horse and loved him for it, saw that he was capable of feeling, capable of loss, capable of the vulnerabilities that made him human despite the divine claims he made. But the army could go no further. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander's soldiers refused to march. They had been away from home for 8 years. They had crossed the known world and entered the unknown. They had followed their king through deserts and mountains and jungles. And now they learned that beyond the Hyphasis lay another great river, the Ganges, and beyond the Ganges a kingdom more powerful than any they had faced, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The prospect of more years of marching, more years of fighting, more distance between themselves and everything they had known, it was too much. They wept. They begged. They refused. Alexander sat alone in his tent for 3 days. The silence of the camp surrounded him. His officers came to plead with him, to explain that the men could not continue, that the army's will was broken. Alexander did not respond. He was wrestling with something that had never happened before, the discovery that his will had limits, that there were things he could not command, that even he could not reshape reality by desire alone. The edge of the world lay just beyond the river. The complete conquest that he had imagined, reaching the Eastern Ocean, circumnavigating the globe, becoming master of everything there was, would not happen. The dream was incomplete. On the 4th day, Alexander emerged. He announced that the signs were unfavorable for continuing, that the gods had indicated retreat. The face-saving explanation allowed the army to turn back without appearing to have defied their king. But everyone knew what had really happened. Alexander had been defeated not by any enemy army but by the exhaustion and homesickness of his own men. The invincible conqueror had met his limit. The chapter closes with the turning back, the long journey toward Babylon that lay ahead, the admission that even Alexander's reach had its boundaries. The rain continued falling on the Hyphasis. The river flowed toward lands he would never see, and the conqueror who had reshaped the world walked west, leaving the edge of the world unconquered. The endless march that had finally ended, the dream that had finally proven too vast, the moment when Alexander discovered what ordinary men had always known, that there are limits to what will can achieve, that the world does not bend completely to desire, that even kings are constrained by the humanity of those who follow them. The march, the limit, the turning back, forever testimony to ambition's boundaries. Forever. Babylon received Alexander with ancient grandeur. The Ishtar Gate shimmered blue in the sun, its glazed brick lions processing eternally toward eternity. The ziggurat, the great stepped temple, rose against the sky, older than memory, dedicated to Marduk, chief god of a civilization that had flourished while Greece was still in darkness. The hanging gardens, if they existed, cascaded with green life in the midst of the desert. Scholars and priests of a tradition stretching back 3,000 years offered their wisdom to the young conqueror who was now their king. Babylon had welcomed many conquerors before: Assyrians, Persians, now Macedonians. The city had outlasted them all and would outlast this one too. But Alexander did not know this. In 323 BCE, he was planning new conquests: Arabia, Carthage, perhaps the western Mediterranean, perhaps circumnavigation of Africa. The world was still not enough. We enter this chapter through the omens that gathered like storm clouds around the king. Seers and astrologers warned against entering Babylon from the west, urged him to take another route. Alexander ignored them at first, then tried to comply, found the alternate route impassable, and entered anyway. A strange figure was discovered sitting upon Alexander's throne, a madman dressed in royal robes who could not explain how he had gotten there or why. The incident was so disturbing that even Alexander, who often dismissed omens, was shaken. The priests of Marduk urged him to perform rituals of purification. Something dark was approaching. The warnings were everywhere. But Alexander had never turned back from anything because of fear, and he did not turn back now. The final weeks were a blur of activity. Embassies arrived from across the known world, some say from Rome, from Carthage, from Spain, from peoples who had never heard of Macedonia but who had heard of Alexander. He received them with the ceremonial splendor of an Eastern monarch, seated on a golden throne, wearing robes that combined Greek and Persian elements, surrounded by guards from every nation of his empire. He planned, he organized, he prepared fleets for the Arabian campaign that would begin in weeks. The energy was frenetic, almost desperate, as though he sensed that time was running out. The banquets continued as they had for years, long nights of drinking and celebration and planning. Alexander had always drunk heavily by Macedonian standards, and Macedonian standards were heavy. Some sources suggest that his drinking had increased in recent years, that the deaths of friends and the burdens of rule had pushed him toward excess. Others suggest that the drinking of these final weeks was nothing unusual, was simply continuation of patterns established long before. We cannot know. We know only that after a particularly long night of feasting at the house of his companion Medius, Alexander fell ill. The fever came quickly and did not leave. For 10 days, Alexander lingered. The sources provide day-by-day accounts of his decline, preserved in what may have been the official court journal. He continued to conduct business as long as he could, receiving generals, issuing orders, planning the Arabian campaign that he still believed he would lead. He made sacrifices at the temples, was carried on a litter when he could no longer walk. But the fever did not break. His voice failed. By the 9th day, he could no longer speak. He could only raise his hand in recognition as his officers filed past his bed, each hoping for a word, each receiving only that silent acknowledgment. The soldiers demanded to see him. The rumors of his death had already begun to spread, and the army would not believe he still lived unless they saw him with their own eyes. Alexander ordered the doors opened. The common soldiers, the men who had followed him across the world, who had fought beside him in battles that would be remembered for millennia, filed past his bed in an endless stream. He acknowledged each one with a movement of his eyes, with the faintest gesture of his hand. He could not speak, but he saw them. They saw him. The bond between king and army, forged in a decade of shared hardship and triumph, was honored one final time. What killed Alexander? The question has been debated for 23 centuries. The ancient sources suggest fever, typhoid perhaps, or malaria, or some other infectious disease endemic to Mesopotamia. Modern theorists have proposed poison, a conspiracy among his generals, perhaps, or the accumulated resentment of those he had slighted or threatened. The symptoms described in the sources have been analyzed and reanalyzed, matched against various candidates, never conclusively identified. We do not know. We may never know. What we know is that on the 11th day of June, 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander the Great drew his last breath. He was 32 years old. When asked to whom he left his empire, the stories say he whispered either to the strongest or to Crateros, his trusted general. The Greek words are similar enough that either interpretation is possible. The ambiguity may have been intentional, or Alexander may have been too far gone to speak clearly, or the story may be invention, added later to explain the chaos that followed. Whatever Alexander intended, whatever he said or did not say, the result was clear enough. There was no clear successor. The empire he had built through force of will and personal charisma had no mechanism for transferring power. It would have to be divided, or it would have to be seized. The chapter closes in the moment of death, in the silence that followed the last breath, in the strange suspension between one era and the next. The generals looked at each other across the deathbed. The soldiers waited outside, not yet knowing. The city of Babylon continued its ancient business, indifferent to the death of yet another conqueror within its walls. And Alexander, the boy from Pella who had dreamed of the edge of the world, the young king who had crossed the Hellespont and conquered everything before him, the living God who had claimed divinity at Siwa and proved it through victory. After victory, Alexander was gone. The fever had succeeded where armies had failed. Mortality had conquered the conqueror. The silence that followed was absolute. The empire held its breath. And then slowly everything began to unravel. The fever in Babylon, the silence of kings, the death that ended an era. Forever the mystery of what killed him. Forever the question of what he might have achieved if he had lived. Forever the silence that falls when the extraordinary becomes mortal. The fever, the silence, the ending, forever. In the years after Alexander's death, his generals turned upon each other like wolves. The empire that had been held together by one man's will and charisma fragmented into warring kingdoms, each led by a commander who had once served at Alexander's side, each determined to claim as much of the inheritance as possible. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, would consume 4 decades, would kill hundreds of thousands, would result in the complete erasure of Alexander's bloodline, and would ultimately produce the Hellenistic kingdoms that Rome would later conquer. The unity that Alexander had achieved through conquest lasted only as long as he lived. The moment he died, the dissolution began. We enter this chapter through the chaos of the funeral cortege. Alexander's body was embalmed in Babylon, preserved with Egyptian techniques that would keep it recognizable for centuries. A magnificent hearse was constructed, a golden temple on wheels that took 2 years to build, drawn by 64 mules and accompanied by a massive retinue. The body was meant to go to Macedonia, to be buried with the Argead kings who had ruled before Alexander. But Ptolemy, the general who had claimed Egypt as his portion of the divided empire, intercepted the cortege, hijacked Alexander's corpse, carried it to Memphis, and later to Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded. The body of the conqueror became another prize to be seized, a source of legitimacy for whoever possessed it. The generals had divided the empire at Babylon, a hasty partition meant to prevent immediate war. Perdiccas, who held Alexander's signet ring, became regent for Alexander's half-brother, mentally incapacitated, and unborn child Roxana was pregnant when Alexander died. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took Babylon. Antigonus took Asia Minor. Lysimachus took Thrace. Antipater held Macedonia and Greece. The division was unstable from the first. Each general wanted more. Each suspected the others of plotting. Within a year, war had begun. The first to fall was Perdiccas, murdered by his own officers after a failed invasion of Egypt. Then Antipater died of old age, and his succession was contested. Antigonus, who dreamed of reuniting Alexander's empire under his own rule, fought against coalitions of all the other successors. Battles were fought across the ancient world in Asia Minor, in Syria, in Babylon, in Egypt, in Greece. The armies that had conquered Persia together now slaughtered each other with the same discipline and ferocity. And the royal family was systematically eliminated. Alexander's half-brother Philip III Arihideus was murdered by Olympias in 317 BCE, Alexander's own mother, fighting to secure the throne for Alexander's son. Olympias herself was killed the following year, executed by the soldiers of Cassander, who had seized Macedonia. Roxana and her son Alexander IV were kept alive for years, useful as pawns, as sources of legitimacy for whoever controlled them. But in 310 BCE, when the boy was 13, old enough to begin asserting his own claim, Cassander had them both murdered. The direct line of Alexander the Great was extinct. His empire had no legitimate heir. What followed was decades more of warfare among successors who could not defeat each other decisively. Antigonus came closest to reunification at his peak. He controlled most of the empire and declared himself king, a title the other successors had avoided as long as any of Alexander's blood remained alive. But Antigonus was finally defeated and killed at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, when he was 80 years old, still fighting, still dreaming of Alexander's inheritance. The battle effectively ended any hope of reunification. The empire was permanently divided. Three great kingdoms emerged from the chaos. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy's descendants for 3 centuries, until Cleopatra, the last of the line, died in 30 BCE. The Seleucid Empire in the east, stretching at its height from Turkey to Afghanistan, ruled by Seleucus's descendants until conquered by Rome and Parthia. The Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, ruled by Antigonus's grandson and his successors until Roman conquest in 168 BCE. These kingdoms would carry Greek culture across the ancient world, would build cities and libraries and centers of learning, would create the Hellenistic civilization that would later be absorbed into Rome. But they were not what Alexander had envisioned, not the universal empire he had dreamed of, not the fusion of East and West he had begun to implement. The chapter dwells in the tragedy of this unraveling. Alexander had begun to imagine something unprecedented, an empire where Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Egyptian, Indian and Babylonian might all be integrated into a new whole. He had married Persian princesses, had encouraged his officers to do the same, had begun promoting Persians to positions of authority, had adopted elements of Persian dress and ceremonial, had attempted in his final years to create a ruling class that transcended ethnic categories. The vision was incomplete when he died. Perhaps it was impossible. Perhaps the prejudices of his Macedonian officers, who resented every accommodation to Persian customs, would have prevented it regardless. But with Alexander's death, even the attempt was abandoned. His successors had no interest in fusion. They established Greek-ruled kingdoms over subject populations, extracting wealth and maintaining power through military dominance rather than through integration. The closing reflection returns to the silence that followed Alexander's last breath. In that silence, the future was not yet determined. The generals might have worked together, might have preserved unity, might have honored Alexander's vision. Instead, they chose conflict, chose personal ambition over collective purpose, chose to fight over the inheritance rather than build upon it. The wars of the successors, the destruction of the royal family, the shattering of unity. Forever testimony to what is lost when extraordinary leaders die without clear succession. Forever evidence of the fragility of empires built on personal charisma. Forever the tragedy of Alexander's legacy, extraordinary achievement followed by extraordinary failure, conquest that was undone by the very men who had made it possible. The successors, the wars, the shattering, forever. Centuries passed, and Alexander became myth. The historical man, complicated, contradictory, brilliant and brutal, dissolved into legend, was transformed by centuries of storytelling into something simpler and more symbolic. In Persia, he became Iskander, a figure of Islamic legend who built walls against monsters and discovered the fountain of youth. In medieval Europe, he joined the Nine Worthies, the exemplars of chivalric virtue whom knights were taught to emulate. In the distant corners of Afghanistan and Pakistan, tribes claim descent from his soldiers to this day, maintain oral traditions about the yellow-haired king who came from the West and never truly left. We enter this chapter through the strange afterlife of a man who died young. The Alexander Romance, a collection of fantastical tales that began accumulating within decades of his death and continued growing for 1,000 years, spread across the medieval world in hundreds of versions and dozens of languages. In these stories, Alexander descends to the ocean floor in a glass diving bell, seeing wonders no mortal has ever seen. He ascends to heaven carried by eagles, meeting sages and angels at the world's edge. He encounters headless men and dog-faced warriors, battles dragons and consults with trees that speak prophecy. The historical Alexander would have been bewildered by these tales and perhaps amused, perhaps gratified, to see how completely he had captured humanity's imagination. Why did the legend endure? Why does Alexander remain one of the few ancient figures whose name is recognized by ordinary people around the world? The chapter explores the elements that made his story immortal, the combination of youth and death, of limitless ambition and ultimate mortality. Alexander died at 32, unconquered at the height of his powers. He never experienced decline, never grew old and weak, never saw his empire crumble. The premature death preserved him in amber, kept him forever young, forever reaching for horizons he would never quite grasp. The tragedy of early death transformed into eternal youth. There was also the sheer scale of what he achieved. Alexander conquered more territory more quickly than anyone before or since. He remade the map of the ancient world. He spread Greek culture from Egypt to Afghanistan, from Libya to India. The cities he founded, most named Alexandria, became centers of learning and commerce that shaped the development of human civilization. The cultural fusion he began, though incomplete and imperfect, created the Hellenistic world from which Western and Islamic civilizations would both draw. The achievements were real, were enormous, were transformative in ways that outlasted the man by millennia. And there was the mystery. We do not know what killed Alexander, do not know what he believed about his own divinity, do not know what his final words truly were, do not know what he would have accomplished if he had lived another decade or two. The gaps in the historical record create space for imagination, for projection, for the endless elaboration that legend requires. Alexander becomes mirror for every age's anxieties and aspirations. To the Renaissance, he was exemplar of virtue, the virile energy that made great men. To Napoleon, he was model of military genius and imperial ambition. To contemporary scholars, he is test case for debates about empire and colonialism, about cultural exchange and cultural destruction. Each age sees in Alexander what it needs to see. The legend is infinitely adaptable, but beneath the legends, beneath the centuries of interpretation and elaboration, there was a real man, a real human being who ate and slept and loved and grieved and made choices that affected millions. The chapter dwells in the effort to see that man, to strip away the mythological accretions and find the historical Alexander beneath. The effort is ultimately impossible. The sources are too limited, too biased, too far removed from the events they describe. We can construct plausible interpretations but not certainties. We can argue about what Alexander was really like but never prove our arguments. The real man is lost, buried beneath the legend he became. Perhaps that is appropriate. Alexander himself was obsessed with fame, with glory, with achieving immortality through achievement. He wanted to be remembered, wanted his name to echo through the ages, wanted to surpass Achilles and all the heroes of antiquity. He achieved that. His name is remembered. His story is told and retold in 1,000 forms. He became exactly what he wanted to become: a legend, a symbol, a name that conjures images of conquest and glory and the outer limits of human ambition. The cost of that immortality was the loss of his humanity. The legend consumed the man, but the legend endures. The chapter closes in meditation on memory itself, on how history becomes legend, becomes dream. Somewhere in Alexandria, the city he founded, the city named for him, the city where his body rested for centuries before disappearing from the historical record, Alexander may still lie. The tomb has never been found. Earthquakes and floods and centuries of construction have buried the ancient city beneath the modern one. Perhaps his bones have been scattered, lost to the ages. Perhaps they wait still in some undiscovered chamber, preserved in the darkness, waiting to be found. The search continues. Amateur archaeologists and professional scholars keep looking, keep hoping to find the tomb that would be the greatest archaeological discovery of the modern age. But perhaps not finding the tomb is appropriate too. The mystery remains. The legend cannot be fixed to a specific location, cannot be confined to a specific set of remains. Alexander remains everywhere and nowhere, a ghost who haunts the imagination, a name that conjures visions of possibility and limits, of glory and mortality, of the strange hunger that drives some souls to reach beyond all reasonable bounds. The legend that refused to die, the man who became myth, the immortality he sought and achieved, forever remembered, forever legendary, forever somewhere between history and dream. The legend, forever. All empires return to dust. The kingdoms of Alexander's successors fell to Rome. Rome fell to time and its own internal contradictions. The stones that Alexander walked upon lie buried beneath modern cities whose inhabitants have forgotten what legends sleep beneath their feet. The Hellenistic world that Alexander created, the fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that shaped the ancient Mediterranean for 3 centuries, is now accessible only through fragments. Fragments of sculpture with their paint faded away. Fragments of texts preserved by accident in desert sands. Fragments of buildings whose original splendor can only be guessed at. The mighty reduced to the fragmentary. The eternal becomes the forgotten, and the silence grows deeper with every passing year. We enter this final chapter through the ruins. The scattered columns of Persepolis, blackened still by the fire Alexander lit or allowed. The foundations of the 70 cities he reportedly founded, most of them absorbed into later settlements, their Macedonian origins invisible to those who walk upon them. The mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, traveled now by shepherds who know nothing of the army that once crossed them, who care nothing for kings dead 23 centuries. The world moves on. History accumulates. And Alexander becomes more distant with every generation, more abstract, more difficult to imagine as a real person who breathed and ate and loved and killed. The chapter becomes meditation on impermanence, on the strange immortality of those who sought to conquer everything and could not conquer death. Alexander wanted to be remembered, and he is remembered. But the person who wanted to be remembered no longer exists. The consciousness that craved fame has been extinct for over 2,000 years. If immortality means continuing consciousness, continuing experience, continuing self, then Alexander achieved no immortality at all. He is as dead as the most forgotten peasant who ever lived and died in obscurity. The fame is real. The person who benefits from it is not. And yet, something persists. The name still conjures images. The story still inspires and disturbs. The questions his life raises about ambition and achievement, about conquest and culture, about what it means to reach for the impossible remain relevant in ways that transcend historical context. When we contemplate Alexander, we contemplate ourselves, our own desires for significance, our own fears of mortality, our own attempts to leave marks that will outlast us. The particulars of his life are ancient. The themes are eternal. The chapter dwells in the question of whether conquest can ever be justified. Alexander's achievements were inseparable from violence on an enormous scale. Hundreds of thousands died in his wars. Cities were destroyed. Populations were enslaved. The suffering he caused was real and incalculable. Against this must be set what followed: the spread of Greek culture, the libraries and academies, the philosophical schools, the scientific advances, the cultural mixing that enriched both East and West. Does the civilization justify the slaughter? Can liberation compensate for conquest? These questions have no final answers. Each generation must weigh them anew. Each individual must reach their own conclusions. We also dwell in what was lost. Alexander's vision of cultural fusion, of an empire that transcended ethnic divisions, was abandoned by his successors and never fully attempted again until the modern era. The Hellenistic kingdoms maintained Greek dominance over subject populations. Rome would do the same. The pattern of conquest and exploitation of ruling class and ruled persisted for millennia. Was Alexander's vision ever achievable? Would his fusion have worked if he had lived longer? We cannot know. We can only recognize that the attempt was made, that it failed, that the alternative paths were never traveled, the road not taken, the possibility foreclosed, the question of what might have been. The closing reflection returns to Pella, to the palace where a boy once sat at Aristotle's feet, learning to question everything. That boy became something beyond human understanding: conqueror and dreamer, philosopher and killer, mortal who sought divinity and found only death. He is gone now. They are all gone: the companions who followed him, the enemies who opposed him, the historians who wrote about him, the skeptics who doubted, and the believers who worshipped. The ancient world they inhabited is gone, survived only in fragments and reconstructions, in stories that may or may not be true, in legends that are certainly not. And what remains is the silence, the deep silence of history, the silence that claims all things mortal and most things immortal too, the silence that waits at the end of every life and every empire and every civilization, the silence that Alexander must have glimpsed in his final fever when words failed and the light was failing and everything he had built was sliding away from his weakening grasp. That silence claims us all, claims the greatest and the least, claims the conquerors and the conquered alike. Let the eyes grow heavy now. Let the breath slow. Let the ancient silence carry you into sleep, where perhaps the dreams of conquerors still wait, still reaching for edges of worlds they will never find. The night holds you. The darkness is kind. And somewhere in that darkness, in the deep spaces where memory dissolves into forgetting, Alexander rests or does not rest, perhaps still dreaming of horizons, perhaps still reaching, perhaps still believing that one more victory, one more conquest, one more transformation would finally be enough. But it is never enough. That is the secret his life reveals. The hunger that drove him was inexhaustible. The horizons kept receding. The edge of the world was always one more march away. And death came before he found it, as death comes for us all, regardless of what we have conquered or failed to conquer, regardless of what empires we have built or lives we have lived. The dust of empires, the silence that remains, the ending that claims all beginnings, and the strange persistence of stories, of names, of legends that flicker still against the darkness, speaking of what once was, of what once mattered, of what once seemed so important and now is only echoes. Rest now. Let the story close. Let Alexander fade back into the silence from which he briefly emerged. Let the night take you where it will, into dreams that may hold nothing or everything, into the same darkness that has held the conqueror for 23 centuries. The story is finished. The silence deepens, and the dust of empires settles slowly, covering everything, making all things equal in the end. The dust, the silence, the peace that follows all striving, let it take you now. Let it carry you into rest, into silence, into the same darkness that holds the great and the forgotten alike, into sleep, rest,